Hello there everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Sound and Sophia. And today we're gonna learn how to ruthlessly destroy our opponents in any kind of arguments. I would say that philosophy is probably one of the most abstract subjects. So therefore it is very important that our logic is 100% bulletproof. So at first, let's begin with the foundation on which logic itself stands upon. And yes, we have to go back to yet another ancient Greek philosopher, but this time it's Aristotle.
Logic is based upon three basic principles. The first principle is the law of identity, and it states, for all A equals A. Here Aristotle wrote in his work Metaphysics. This at least is obviously true, that the word be or not be has a definite meaning, so that not everything will be so and not so. If, however, they were not limited but one were to say that the word has an infinite number of meanings, obviously reasoning would be impossible. For not to have one meaning is to have no meaning. And if words have no meaning, our reasoning with one another, and indeed with ourselves, has been annihilated. For it is impossible to think of anything if we do not think of one thing. But if this is possible, one name might be assigned to this thing.
The second principle is the law of contradiction. Nothing can both be and not be at the same time. In other words, two or more contradictory statements cannot be true in the same sense at the same time.
The last and probably the most disputed principle is the law of excluding middle. Everything must either be or not be. Where there is two contradictory propositions, i.e., where one proposition is the negation of the other, one must be true and the other false. For instance, if I would tap up a hot bath, at some point the bath will not be hot anymore, it will be cold. You could say that it is lukewarm at some point, but then you're adding in a new term. The point is, at an instantaneous moment, the bath goes from being hot to being cold. It can't be both at the same time. So that's it. Here we have three basic principles of logic.
If you really want to be able to win any kind of argument, you need to be able to analyze your opponent's argument in depth to see if their argument is valid and logically sound.
A typical argument is usually composed out of sets of premises that then leads to a conclusion. We have already touched upon this when I explained induction in the last episode. Every instance of a white swan can be seen as a premise, and all swans are white is the conclusion.
But as we said before, induction is not a good method at all. So let's go through another one, a very important one, and it is Sherlock Holmes' favorite, namely deduction.
As a matter of fact, Sherlock Holmes is painfully incorrect in calling his method deduction. Here is a typical deductive argument. 1. Every man is mortal. 2. Socrates is a man. Conclusion: Socrates is mortal. The main point of a deductive argument is that it is indisputable. If the premises are correct, then the conclusion is necessarily correct as well. An easy way to see this is when you reduce the argument to a simple form. All x's are y's. P is an X. Conclusion, P is Y.
A big critique of deduction would be that some philosophers would consider it a tautology. What I mean by that is that you are actually not adding any meaning to the argument. Take the statement, all bachelors are unmarried. The problem with that is that with the word bachelor already contains the meaning of being unmarried. It's like saying 1 equals 1. So the same thing goes with the argument about Socrates being mortal. Nothing new is added in the conclusion.
Let's talk a little bit about the difference of validity and soundness. Take this argument. All poops are intelligent. Yellow is a poop. Therefore, yellow is intelligent. All utter nonsense. But this is still a valid deductive argument. It is valid, but it's not considered sound. For a deductive argument to be sound, the premises has also to be correct and make sense. So a good argument has to be logically valid and sound.
So if Sherlock Holmes didn't use deductive reasoning, what did he use then? Well, in a matter of fact, his method is actually called abductive reasoning, or inference to the best explanation. But saying that Sherlock is using abduction doesn't make him seem like the good guy, does it? The logical form of abductive reasoning was coined by Charles Saunders Peirce, and the easiest way to explain it is with a legal case.
Let's say that a man is found hanging from a rope inside a house far off in the mountains, with the door locked from the inside. Next to him, a letter written in his own handwriting, describing how awful life is, so he decided to hang himself. Saying that the man committed suicide is a logical abduction in this case. It is the simplest explanation, but the problem with abductive reasoning is that unlike deductive reasoning, the conclusion inferred from the premises can be false.
For instance, there could have been a murderer who have invented a teletransporter, got into the house, forced the man to write a suicide letter, hanged him, and then teleported out again. This example is, of course, absurd, but the point is that with abductive reasoning, there is always an element of uncertainty. A good example of how abductive reasoning is used in science is string theory, advanced by the scientist Sheldon Cooper. Well, but the point is that at this moment, string theory is untestable. There is no way for us right now to empirically prove it, but the point is that string theory explains a lot of phenomena in the universe. So it is an abducted theory. A very important part about argumentation is fallacies. If you can realize that at the bottom of your opponent's argument is a fallacy, a certain victory is at hand, even if your opponent doesn't agree. So what is a fallacy then? Well, basically, all fallacies are results of poor reasoning. So it would actually be a good idea to learn to recognize these different types of fallacies, since there are many.
So here is a couple of fallacies. As you can see, there is quite a lot of them. But let's go through some. Let's begin with a formal fallacy. A common one is called affirming the consequent. Take this logical structure. If Pelle got a new job, he will be playing on a new grand piano tomorrow. Pelle is playing on a new grand piano. Therefore, Pelle's got a new job.
This is what is called a formal fallacy. The problem here is that you could be mistaken. I could have won the lottery instead of getting the job. But if we just tweak the argument a little bit, it wouldn't be a fallacy anymore.
If you've seen my video on epistemology, you might have already noticed the solution. If you were to change the first premise to, if and only if Pelle's got a new job, he will be playing on a new grand piano tomorrow. Pelle is playing on a new grand piano. Therefore, Pelle's got a new job. Now here, the argument is valid. In ordinary language, when we use the word if, we might actually mean if and only if. But in logic, we should always aim to be precise, because the difference is very important.
There are also what is called informal fallacies. A very common one is what is called the gambler fallacy.
If I've already tossed 10 heads in a row, the possibility that the 11th toss will be a heads is less than 50%. That is, I am due for a tails. I've already tossed 10 heads. Therefore, the probability that the next toss will yield a tails is less than 50%. In a matter of fact, this is a valid argument. If we change it to this, if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. So there is nothing wrong with the form of this argument. But the first premise here is simply false. It doesn't matter how many heads you have had in a row, the chance of getting a heads will always be 50% at every instance. The problem is probably that people simply asked the wrong question. If the question was, what is the chance of getting 10 heads in a row, then that is a totally different matter. But at every instance, the chance will always be 50%.
Another common fallacy is what is called the slippery slope fallacy. And it usually occurs when someone wants to prevent someone from committing a certain type of action.
The logical form of this argument goes like this. If A, then B, then C, then D. D is undesirable, therefore not A. As a kid, I stumbled upon this argument. A friend told me during winter, put on your hat, otherwise you will get a cold. And if you get a cold, you will begin to whisper. And if you begin to whisper, you will begin to lie. And if you lie, you'll end up with bad people. And then you'll go to prison. So put on your damn hat. It was a joke of sorts, because I had forgot my hat at home. But we both knew that there was something fishy about the argument. And it is a very typical example of a slippery slope fallacy. The problem with the slippery slope fallacy is that there is always a chance that one of the premises will not occur. There could be an argument that has the same structure without being a fallacy. But then you have to show that every step will always cause the other. And that is very, very hard, I would say.
There are many more fallacies, and I would really recommend you guys to look them up. But that's it for today, everyone. Now you will be able to win all your future arguments. In the next episode, we will conclude this series with ethics. But until then, have a good one.